Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I am your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Hermann Pretorius. Hermann, how are you doing?
Good to see you again, Nick. Good to see you too, Terence. It's been a while, but Nick ultimately tracked me down, and
Yes,
I couldn't. I simply didn't have the funds to pay the bond or the bailout.
Yeah, there's definitely no escape from the Daily Friend Show podcast roster. And also, Mr. Terence Corrigan. Terence, how are you doing?
I'm good, Nicholas. I'm good.
Well, I just want to give a shout out to a listener, a regular viewer, rather, I met yesterday, who was a bit under the weather, so I hope he is feeling better. Let us get into our first news story of today. And this is a pretty short opinion column by Tom Eaton, which I think was in the Times Live. And it's titled, "Bitter Poll to Swallow. One Can't Let Facts Get in the Way of a Good Headline." So in it, he talks a little bit about the Social Research Foundation polling that we've talked about so far this week, which suggested that, I mean, there were a number of explosive things in that, but that the DA would get about 25% of the votes. The ANC would drop to 37% of the vote. This is, I think, their lowest poll ever that I've seen. And that Zuma's new MK party would win about 13% of the vote, with about 11% going to the EFF, 5% to the IFP. So he starts off in his column by pouring water on this, saying that there's no way that the DA is going to get, or he doesn't say it in these words, but he suggests that there's no real way that the DA will get 25% of the vote, because that would mean an increase of roughly 750,000 voters since 2019, which I don't think is something you can say necessarily with much confidence. Firstly, we don't know how big the election is going to be. In fact, there's many indications that it might be quite a lot smaller, in which case you don't need 750,000 votes. But he does create this quite amusing image. He says the only way they're going to get that many votes is if they make the party leader some sort of weird fusion of Chris Pappas and Jordan Hill Lewis, two of their most famous and successful mayors, which he called Turden Lupus, which is quite a fun image, I think. But he also goes on to say that not even the most beloved and respected president could expect to remain leader of his party after taking that party from 57% to 37%, saying that this is referring to Ramaphosa, saying that he'd be toast. There was also then a bit of media reporting about the what's it called, the plunge in the rand on the news of this poll, and which he points out was really not so dramatic. In fact, the plunge was putting it back to where it had been at the beginning of the week. So I think that's a very legitimate criticism about some of the plunge in the rand stories reported on this. But he ends off the piece by saying, yes, it's a good ghost story, but as that plunging rand reminds us, there's a difference between a good story and a true one. Now, what frustrates me a little bit about this piece, Herman, is that it really firstly doesn't actually, he basically is just saying, we shouldn't take this poll too seriously, this is fantasy. But he doesn't actually say why necessarily, just that, you know, this is quite a, this would be a big change, is essentially his only reason. He only uses some numbers to describe why the polling result for the DA is a little bit unlikely. But I don't know, this really seems to me as a kind of a whistling past the graveyard thing, particularly on MK. Now, there are a lot of reasons to think that MK has a very low ceiling, and that it will never get that much support, because Zuma is both popular and very unpopular at the same time, depending on where you go in the country. But, you know, I think this is kind of the result of what we might call bubble analytics. You know, everyone in politics at some point is accused of being in their own bubble, but I think this very much is a case of that, which is that in the sort of media circles, the two most in odor parties are anything that Zuma touches and the DA. And he's sort of skeptical that those two could be the beneficiaries of this election. But I don't know, Herman. I think the polling and some of the on-the-ground stuff shows that in fact might be the two beneficiaries of this election. What do you make of this?
So the first thing is I love opinion polling. I don't always understand the nuances. I'm after all not a statistician or something, but I try my best, and I genuinely love it. I think it. I love it perhaps for the same reason that many journalists and ordinary South Africans love it. It gives you that idea of knowing something on the inside, sort of forbidden knowledge. It's a cheat sheet into insight. That said, polling must be taken not perhaps with grains of salt, but with the salt shaker nearby, in the sense that a single poll like this shouldn't be considered astronomically important. What becomes important in polling is trajectories and trends. That is where polling becomes its most useful self, is it if it gives you an idea of change over time. Now, this poll has a margin of error of 2.2%. So the ANC on 37 might be as high as 39.2. That is actually quite close to previous polls from the Brenthurst Foundation, from the SRF, over the last few months, that have put the ANC in the region of 40%. Now, one can imagine looking at polls from before December, an ANC of 45%, which is, mid to high 40s is where IRR polling put the ANC support at the end of last year. The shift that the MK party has brought about is sufficient enough to, if the polls bear out that they get between 20 and 30% in KwaZulu-Natal, that would translate to a 5% percentage point dip for the ANC nationally. So an ANC in the region of 40% seems to be quite within the expected trajectory of where the polls have been pointing towards. Now, so firstly, I don't think that this poll is massively off. It seems to be quite in line with what you hear from within inside the parties and the public polling on this. So I think Mr. Eaton is perhaps doing himself no services in being glib about what this poll might mean. And then on a more perhaps anecdotal level, one shouldn't underestimate what Jacob Zuma as a political brand in South Africa can mean. I got a bit of a wake-up call earlier this year when I was just exiting a news studio, and there were two security guards, and I sort of asked them on a whim, what are your thoughts? I just had an interview about politics and about polling and so on. What are your thoughts on where we're at? The one lady said to me she's a DA supporter. She loves it. She's got a DA shirt. She'll be voting DA. And the other one said to me, it's the time for Zuma. And I asked this other lady, why was it the time for Zuma? And she said, well, Ramaphosa couldn't protect us against COVID, but during Zuma's presidency, he protected us against Ebola. And then the other security guard chimed in, the DA supporter chimed in and said, oh, and remember, he was good on AIDS policy, on the rollout of AIDS medicine. Now, these aren't necessarily true analytical bits, but they are useful in indicating that the South African voter is an odd creature with weird levels of fluctuating sophistication. I never expected the 2014 Ebola threat in continental Africa to play a role in the 2024 election. And yet here was someone on the ground without any prompting, using that as evidence of Jacob Zuma's competence as president. Now, of course, that's not statistically representative, but it is a warning to even us on this call to not let ourselves be too led by whatever might be happening within the bubble. So the fact that these voters are out there, that this sort of thinking might be out there, I'm not saying it's representative, is something that should give someone like Tom Eaton a bit of pause in being too strident about what a Zuma political movement in 2024 might mean. Zuma is a rather impressive politician. Most politicians, were they to be fired as the deputy president of a country amidst multiple hundreds of corruption scandals, that would probably be the end of their career. It wasn't for Zuma. He managed to fight back from such a massive humiliation. And true, he departed then the Union buildings in another fit of humiliation. But this isn't a man who goes down without a fight. This is someone who has been a street fighter politician for as long as there have been street fighter politicians in the later half of the 20th century and today. It is completely realistic that the numbers of this poll stack up. They seem to fit the overall trends. They seem to fit my expectations of parties like the EFF and Action SA, both of which are struggling to gain traction. And the idea that Jacob Zuma might benefit from the ANC's obvious electoral challenges, not speaking even to the budgetary challenges and how much money, cold hard cash it takes to fight an election campaign. I think you're quite right that this bubble type of analysis is risky in the sense that it misses the unpredictable nature of the creature that is South African democracy. Nothing about the data we see here is out of the ordinary, and that might just be a good reminder to ourselves that, let's not get too married to something that we might expect to be the ordinary.
So I don't know if it exists anymore, because I think the Daily Sun is very much mostly online these days. I don't think they print in most provinces anymore. But it used to have a letters section. I don't know if it still does. And that was often quite interesting, because this was often very non-political people writing in. I mean, the Daily Sun's basically a tabloid. And when they did occasionally write in on politics, it would often be on issues that you never really expected. Like, I once saw someone criticizing the DA for attacking Zuma for his dancing. And this was like sort of several years after that news story had kind of gone through the rounds. And I think that there is, because there's so much disconnect actually between the population and the sort of day-to-day news cycle. And this is not just a South African trend, it's a global trend, but it's particularly bad in South Africa. You can't really tell exactly what sort of issues are necessarily going to filter down to people. And I think that it is worth mentioning, as you said in that discussion with those two ladies, that the HIV/AIDS stuff that Zuma did, that was probably the highlight of his presidency, in comparison, particularly to the Mbeki years, which had been so atrocious on that. He really was a savior of many people's lives in a practical sense, regardless of how much his wisdom and actual good policy decisions had to do with that change in policy. But I just looked up now. I just went quickly to the Wikipedia page on the South African election for 2024, and they've got a nice little table there with all of the polling. So I looked at the last 8 polls, which go all the way back to September of last year. And this includes everything from the Ipsos polls, which are very down on the DA and high on the EFF, and various other things, and of course the Social Research Foundation polls as well. And if you look at those, the DA is on 24% as an average, and the ANC is on 42.5%. So, just as you said, Hermann, the idea that this is some sort of anomaly that we haven't seen coming now for months is a little bit puzzling. Terence, what do you make of all this? Do you agree with us? What do you make of how impactful this election is going to be?
Well, I think there's a few points. The first one is that I think that there's a dreadful misunderstanding of how polling works. I mean, I'm talking about very intelligent people. A couple of years ago, one of the leading lights at the Daily Maverick wrote attacked one of our polls and saying, you can't just ask a mere 2,500 people. Another leading light at the Daily Maverick, whom I spoke to privately, just chuckled about this and said, "Yeah, well, you have surveys in America that ask 700 people, and they can be fairly accurate." The other thing is that this is an opinion poll with it's not a predictor of behavior. And certainly, Franz Grenier has said this a couple of times. This is not a prediction, and our stuff actually goes out and says this is not a prediction. And doesn't stop certain hostile commentators from saying the IRA predicts. Like just read page 1 where it says this is not a prediction. Never mind. but yeah, he also points out that historically the ANC has been able to surge in the last couple of weeks. That's what squeezing. Everyone squeezes, as much as they can. The largest party gets to squeeze smaller parties, and then for the ANC, that includes parties like the DA. The DA does it to parties like the Freedom Front Plus. So yeah, funny thing that. But yeah, and I do think that there is something else going on here, and that is the idea that compromised Jacob Zuma could possibly have a constituency. Well, I think we should remember there was an almost cult-like devotion that built up around him before he became president. I remember watching Carte Blanche after he'd been in office for about a year or so, and Richard Calland, certainly no fool, talking about how he would give Zuma an upper second for his performance. I remember all of the calling down hellfire and damnation on the Stop Zuma posters. A couple of years later, Stop Zuma seemed to be the editorial line du jour, but never mind. And Zuma lost to Ramaphosa by an absolutely razor-thin margin. I'm sure that there are many people, millions of people, for whom Zuma is actually a very positive figure. Now, you may hate that, you may find that incomprehensible, but that reality is what it is. After the 2016 election in America, the New York Times wondered how they got it so wrong. And one of the answers was that no one knew a Trump voter. And it happens when all of your friends, think the same way. I remember Tony Leon saying in an interview in the 1990s that his father apparently phoned him after the results came in '94 and said, "But everyone I know was going to vote DP." He said, "Yeah, well, Dad, 100 people." And they were all these millions of people voting you don't know. So there you go. Yeah, weird stuff can happen amongst people who think differently. That's why I do think that there is something to be said for the phrase diversity, but just understand it. It means people are different, not that we sort of have different DNA and we all think the same.
Right.
And yes, we may have to, become accustomed to a South African parliament which has a Zuma faction in it.
Indeed. I think it is still worth highlighting once again, though, that, so just to be clear, Zuma is predicting his party is going to get 2/3 of the vote, or at least that's what they're working towards. And that's not going to happen any chance whatsoever. I will stake my entire reputation career on that for sure. I don't think the MK party will ever be able to get more than, I guess, maybe 20% of the vote, something like that, because Zuma is unpopular with many people. But when you're dealing with very large percentages and you have 30% of the people who are greatly in favor of him and 60% of the people who absolutely hate him, that 30% can get you quite a lot of seats in parliament.
We can just look at the ability of the EFF. They've been a 10% party, give or take a few points, and they have had an astounding ability to make the political weather. So it's by no means worth discounting a 10% party. I think the EFF is probably one of the most successful parties of the last 4 election cycles, not because they've grown their vote, but because they've moved the debate to where they want it to be. So if you have a Zuma party, the MK, and they are 10, 13%, don't discount them as a force. Something that I do think Eaton does get right in his opinion piece is his implied criticism of the DA about what lies at the core of the DA's brand strength. And that is local government excellence. I often get very frustrated by the fact that the DA, which is a party that, like it or not, carries in the political arena, at least, the legacy of liberal politics, seem to miss what makes it appealing and what makes it a good vote winner. to a very large extent, the DA's brand strength is built on 3 years of coalition governmentship under Helen Zille in Cape Town between 2006 and 2009. To a very large extent, that still forms the basis of the idea that the DA delivers, the slogan that they took even into the 2021 local government election. And it's no accident that someone like Chris Pappas and Jordan Hill-Lewis, rather than someone like Sifiwe Gwarube or John Steenhuisen, are, recalled to the lab of designing DA potency. Because in the end, the South African voter, when you ask them, what do you think the word government means? You'll get answers like potholes, pavements, streetlights, taps, water, sewage, waste collection, refuse removal. All of these very basic, visible, tangible government stuff, local government competencies. So I do think Eaton is right in calling the DA a bit to its senses and saying, look, if you want your own recipe of success to be perfected, look at Jordan Lewis, look at Chris Pappas, and understand that a small local government win in Mngeni, in a municipality with, I think, under 20 seats in its council, has earned you more political capital than almost any other national project you've managed, because the way South Africans look at you is, are you delivering local government excellence? Yes, then we're going to vote DA. No, then we're not. It's worth remembering that.
All right, let's move on to our next story, and we're going to stay a little bit with the MK party here. There has been a slightly mysterious shakeup within the MK party's youth structures. Now, talking about the structures of the MK party is a little bit difficult because, as Jacob Zuma in his remarks on the shakeup reveal, they actually don't have a formal structure. In fact, in Zuma's own words, they are all interim leaders right now, which is an interesting way to go into a massive election, and shows, I think, the speed at which this whole thing was cobbled together. So the leader of the MK party, who was convicted of encouraging the riots in 2021 July, was removed from he's a suspected instigator. I don't think he was actually convicted, but he was removed as leader of the MK party, along with the Secretary General of the Youth League and also the Gauteng Youth League coordinator. Zuma kind of made unnamed references to this shakeup, saying that he was not going to tolerate bribery, gun-wielding bullies, and imposters. He said, quote, "We are not playing. Nobody is going to do what they want, and not what the party and members want. We will do that even on the eve of elections. If you are out of order, we will remove you. Those who have imposed themselves on the list conducted themselves in a corrupt manner and paid bribes, and think we are not aware of their conduct. We know exactly who they are. Since December, when we announced our existence to the world, we have said that there will be no elective conferences before we win these elections. We don't want to waste time before elections. We need to focus on winning a 2/3 majority, because then, before we can even speak about positions, we need to focus on that, because positions will distract us. People are squabbling over nothing. Have you secured the 2/3 majority? After we've secured the 2/3 majority and informed an interim structure, and this means it does not matter which position you occupy right now. We are all interim leaders. There are no permanent leaders. We want an organization that will respect the nation, people, and its members. What we are doing as Umkhonto weSizwe is fixing this country. We cannot fight over positions. If we want to fix the country, did we form Umkhonto weSizwe for our personal gains?" And then the crowd shouted no. Now, that last line is quite funny when you consider Zuma. But it does, I think, pose an interesting question. And this is, if the first story was about maybe why the MK party should be taken seriously and might do very well in these elections, the second story might be an example of why the party might end up not finishing nearly as high as 13%. Because at the end of the day, in order to fight an election, you need a very big, effective organizational structure. Now, one of the big questions of this election, in my opinion, is how good the ANC's organizational structure is at this stage. We don't know. It's run out of money a bunch of times. It seems to be in kind of chaos. But if they can pull it together, the ANC might be able to rescue itself in a big way. Terence, what do you make of this whole mess? It does seem, firstly, that Zuma is cementing his control over the party with a fairly tight grip, which is to be expected considering that he's half the brand of the party, or 75 to 90% of the brand of the party. But do you think that there could be some organizational vulnerabilities here? What do you make of this?
Yes.
Could you elaborate?
Okay. I presume you want me to elaborate on that. Yeah. Look. You've got a party that seemingly came from nowhere. Although I do think that there's been planning. I think that the reluctance. I've seen the sort of reluctance to have hierarchies in some social movements. The idea is that you kind of you offer everyone a sense of equality. You appeal to the sense of civic mindedness, but it's known who those plum positions will go to. Now, whether Zuma actually ends up in parliament or not, this is a party that I think will do his bidding. And as you say, he's the face of it. Since he's not on board with violence and everything, I'm taking no one's bringing him a machine gun, which I think would be the end of a venerable tradition in that part of the country. But also bear in mind that KwaZulu-Natal is a very violent political culture. Someone once pointed out it's very interesting. The Western Cape has a great deal of violence, gang violence, organized violence, but virtually no political violence. KwaZulu-Natal, it's built in. I think that's going to be that's going to be very unpleasant going forward. I suspect that what he's banking on is getting the seats, getting the positions, because that's kind of what he wants, a support block in a legislature. I'm not sure that he or his leadership have thought further, or perhaps if they have, they want to keep that deliberate ambiguity so that the inevitable fighting for positions is deferred until the votes have been cast, because that will sort of give him the advantage of, let's say, 5, 10, 13% in parliament. That will be very useful to keeping his personal vulnerabilities at bay for the next 5 years. And at the end of it, given that Zuma's in his 80s, maybe it's not really going to matter anymore by the end of it.
Hermann, what do you make of this? Just one more little aside is that he, once again, and this is something he has done publicly before, but he seems to be trying to make very much a theme of it, is he is specifically attacking the legal system as the legal system's greatest opponent. This is not particularly a surprise. But he said, quote, "Why are we fighting amongst ourselves? You will really get to know me. I will be laying down the law. We will be lawmakers of African law, not Roman Dutch law. Roman Dutch law means nothing to us. It's just there to destroy us." End quote. Herman, what do you make of all this?
So I have a rather convoluted theory that I'm yet to properly lay out. But my thinking is that the MK party is a move to not secure a national power base, but to secure the province of KwaZulu-Natal as essentially a Zuma fortress. And the way I would see it play out, very speculatively, is you have Duduzane Zuma remaining in the ANC. You have his father leading MK in KwaZulu-Natal. You have rather spurious litigation efforts around the ascension to the throne of King Misuzulu. None of them that I could see merit any real substance. You've got the July 2021 riots, and you've got the rumors of multiple ANC branches falling to MK control. And then you have this part of Zulu conservatism, Zulu nationalism, this idea that I think you mentioned about Roman Dutch law means nothing to us. I think that is part of Zuma playing very much into the Zulu culturalism, the Zulu nationalism, that he knows becomes his vehicle to prominence or at least influence in KwaZulu-Natal. And the way I see this playing out, and I might be terribly wrong here, is the ANC and the MK and the IFP get roughly equal shares of the vote in KwaZulu-Natal. And you need a team with at least two of those to bring stability. The Zulu king, with the spurious litigation around his ascension to the throne, is made to feel unstable in his position, and MK says to him, we can bring your reign the necessary stability if you endorse a unification of the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal with MK. And we've got the perfect candidate to lead that unification, and that's Duduzane Zuma, who we will then get in to be the perfect premier candidate for KZN. He's a Zuma guy, he's an ANC guy. He brings the Zulu people together in one harmonious and potent force. Endorse him, and you will get your stable kingship. That might explain why Mkhize was something of a stalking horse, to see how far within the establishment control of the ANC, the KwaZulu-Natal ANC was. And it's proved to be quite loose. So there might be some space to carve the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal loose from the national ANC. What you then have is you have a movement that commands the cultural heartlands geographically, the cultural heart through the monarchy. You have Zuma, who is probably one of the most potent populist campaigners. You've got proof of the Zumaite forces' ability to mobilize violently in July 2021. And you all have this unified in electoral decision that calls for united ANC MK front, and the candidate perfect for that is Duduzane Zuma. So taking all that into account, I think it's fine for them if they don't do wonderfully nationally. That's never been part of their goal. Zuma made the mistake first time round to create a patronage network with him at the center, able for him to be removed by the ANC as his ex-wife then lost that election. But if you have the forces on the ground, you have the heart of the people, and you have the spiritual center of your geographical jurisdiction and cultural jurisdiction, you're pretty much set for, I think, about a decade. And you will see something along those lines with Frans Cronje's good old adage of Cape Independence. The route to Cape Independence runs through Mlazi. And I think you will see that push for a more independent Zuma-based KZN patronage network in the years after the election. And that won't be pretty, but it will be certainly interesting.
It is an interesting thing to think about. Terence, any final thoughts on this, on what Hermann just said before we close up for today?
What Hermann said?
Yeah, no, I will admit, Hermann, that I did spend the beginning of the week shouting at anyone who speculated too wildly in South African politics. But I do think there is very much something to your idea there of the sort of Fortress Zuma and KZN, that it becomes like a kind of regional barony that just can't be taken away. And we've seen this a bunch of times in other political scenes. I know in Japan for a while, there was a powerful politician who essentially had a regional barony that he was completely dominant over in rural Japan, and through that he was able to become what has been described as the shadow shogun, able to manipulate Japanese politics. And I think it is a very real political strategy, and one that one does have to watch out for, because it is by that route that patronage and corruption politics becomes extremely entrenched in the society.
Yep.
Is this the Premier League redux?
Possibly, yes. But this time with a more KZN focus.
Anyway,
let us close on that one, and we shall see you all next week. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Cheers, everyone.